The leather-bound ledger sat in the evidence room for 93 years before anyone thought to open it again. Inside, penciled in tight columns across brittle pages, every piece of equipment lowered into the Ashford mine on February 11, 1875. Rope, timber, lamp oil, pickaxes. The superintendent's handwriting never wavered. Each entry matched the ones before. Methodical, unremarkable, the kind of record that survives because no one questions it. Except the final line was written in different ink. The Ashford mine, carved into the limestone hills 40 miles north of Pittsburgh, had operated without incident for 7 years. The company kept impeccable records. The miners knew the shafts. The foreman checked every support beam twice. When the collapse came on February 14th, Valentine's Day, though no one mentioned that in the official reports, it buried 16 men in less than 4 seconds. The investigation that followed called it structural failure, inevitable geology, an act of God if pressed. But that part never aligned, because the company had reinforced those exact tunnels 18 days earlier, because 3 engineers had signed off on the stability, because the foreman's daily logs showed nothing, not a crack, not a tremor, not a single notation suggesting concern. The investigation closed in 11 days. The widows received partial compensation. The mine reopened within 5 months. The absence spoke louder than the reports ever could. Comment what you're doing as you watch this. Ordinary actions surround extraordinary events, and sometimes the contrast itself becomes part of the investigation. The Ashford Coal and Mineral Company owned 4,000 acres by 1875. Not just the mine, the land above it, the housing around it, the general store where miners bought their bread. The company doctor set bones. The company bank held wages. When a miner descended into the earth, he did so inside a system that had already claimed everything he owned on the surface. The main office stood 3 stories tall, brick and iron, with gas lamps burning in the windows long after dark. Inside, the filing cabinets ran floor to ceiling. Payroll, equipment manifests, incident reports. Every sheet of paper bore the company's seal. A pickaxe crossed over a gear, encircled by the words "Progress through extraction." The superintendent, Marcus Holbrook, had held his position for 9 years. His signature appeared on every document of consequence. His handwriting was distinctive, slanted slightly right, capital letters larger than necessary, as if insisting on their own authority. That's why the final line in the February 11th ledger remained unexplained. The ink was darker, a different well perhaps, or a pen refilled mid-entry. The slant tilted left. The capital letters sat at normal height. Someone had added an entry after Holbrook finished his work. One line, squeezed between the last logged item and the page's edge. Additional timber consignment. Delivered secondary shaft. Signed receipt, withheld per instruction. No name, no witness. No corresponding invoice in the company files. 16 men entered the mine on February 14, 1875. Their names survived in the shift manifest, a single sheet of foolscap now kept behind glass in the county historical archive. The handwriting belongs to the mine foreman Jacob Lind, who recorded each miner's arrival at dawn. The ink is faded but legible. The names are listed in the order they descended. Thomas Byrne, Patrick Callahan, Henry Moss, William Corrigan, Samuel Dates, Owen Rafferty, John Pugh, Michael Brennan, Albert Finch, George Whitford, Liam Dolan, Francis Quinn, Edward Marsh, Peter Novak, Joseph Klein, Daniel Shaw. Beside each name, a checkmark. Beside the checkmark, the time they entered, 5:47 a.m. All 16 men went down together, which was unusual. Standard procedure divided shifts into 2 groups, one to advance the tunnel face, one to haul coal to the surface. Splitting the crew reduced risk. If something collapsed, half the men would still be alive. But on February 14th, the entire shift descended in a single group. The foreman's log from that morning contains one additional note, written at the bottom of the page in smaller script. Superintendent request, full crew to secondary shaft, new vein survey. No such survey appears in the company records. The geologist's reports for February make no mention of a new vein. The secondary shaft, in fact, had been declared exhausted 7 months earlier and sealed with timber supports. According to the mine's own documentation, it was no longer in active use, yet 16 men were sent there anyway. The collapse occurred at 9:14 a.m. The exact time is known because the company's surface clock, a large brass piece mounted outside the main office, stopped when the ground shook. The tremor knocked it from its bracket. When the clock was recovered, its hands were frozen. 9 hours, 14 minutes. The sound, according to witnesses, resembled thunder trapped underground. One woman hanging laundry 400 yards from the mine entrance said the earth moved beneath her feet, not violently, but with a slow rolling sway, like standing on a ship. A merchant stocking his shelves in the company store reported that jars fell from the top row, but only the top row. The collapse was localized, surgical almost, confined to a section of tunnel deep enough that the surface showed no visible damage. No fissures, no sinkhole. No indication that anything below had failed. The rescue effort began within 30 minutes. 20 men from the adjacent mine shaft grabbed lanterns and rope and descended. They reached the collapse site by 10:05 a.m. The tunnel had folded inward, support beams splintered, ceiling stones piled 8 feet high, blocking the passage entirely. The air tasted of dust and something metallic, something the rescuers couldn't name. They found no survivors. What they did find, buried in the rubble at the collapse's edge, was a wooden crate, empty. Stamped on the side in black stencil, property of Ashford Coal and Mineral Co., do not open without authorization. The crate was supposed to be in the surface storage warehouse. The county appointed an investigator within 2 days, Charles Whitman, a mine safety inspector with 17 years' experience. His role was to determine cause, assign liability, and recommend preventative measures. He arrived at the Ashford site on February 16th with a leather satchel and a reputation for thoroughness. His previous investigations had shuttered 2 mines for gross negligence. He interviewed 12 witnesses. He examined the rubble. He reviewed the company's maintenance logs, the foreman's daily reports, and the structural assessments completed the month prior. His handwritten notes, preserved in the State Archive, reveal a man assembling a clear picture. The supports were sound, the geology was stable, the crew was experienced. There should have been warning signs, cracking, shifting, the slow groan of stressed timber that miners learn to recognize. There were none. On February 19th, Whitman requested access to the superintendent's office. He wanted the internal correspondence, the equipment orders, the financial ledgers. He wanted to see who authorized the shift to the secondary shaft and why. The company granted him access but assigned a clerk to accompany him. The clerk's name was Howard Penrose. He stood beside Whitman for 6 hours while the inspector leafed through filing cabinets. Whitman's notes from that day are shorter than the others. Only 3 sentences. Requested correspondence regarding secondary shaft operations. Clerk unable to locate. Superintendent unavailable for interview. The next day, Whitman submitted his preliminary findings. The report concluded that the collapse resulted from undetectable structural fatigue in the limestone bedrock. He recommended no charges. He suggested the mine could reopen once cleared. His final report, submitted February 27th, contained 8 pages. It repeated the preliminary findings almost word for word. But the preliminary draft, discovered decades later in Whitman's personal papers, contained 11 pages. 3 pages were missing. Margaret Brennan received the news at noon. Her husband Michael had been the youngest of the 16 men, 23 years old, married 8 months. He'd taken the mining job to save for a house. The company representative arrived at her door with a black armband and an envelope containing $14, 2 weeks' wages. He did not stay long. She did not cry in front of him. The funeral was held on February 21st, a shared service for all 16 men. The caskets were empty. The bodies had not been recovered. The company deemed it too dangerous to excavate that deep. The Episcopal priest spoke about dust and ashes, about God's unknowable design. Margaret sat in the second row, hands folded in her lap, and did not look at the altar. 3 days later, she returned to the mine. She walked past the main gate, past the equipment yard, past the office where the superintendent's lamp still burned. She stood at the sealed entrance to the secondary shaft, the one her husband had entered 4 days earlier, and pressed her hand against the timber barricade. The wood was cold, damp. She stayed there for 11 minutes. According to the site watchman, who later testified, he did not stop her because she was not causing a disturbance. When she left, she carried something in her apron pocket, The watchman couldn't say what it was, only that it hadn't been there when she arrived. Charles Whitman returned to his office in Harrisburg on March 2nd. His final report had been filed. The investigation was closed. The Ashford mine would reopen once debris removal concluded, likely by summer. Whitman had done his job. The county was satisfied. But Whitman kept a second set of notes. These were not official. They were observations, fragments, inconsistencies he couldn't reconcile within the bounds of his formal report. He wrote them in a separate journal, bound in brown leather, kept in his desk drawer. The journal was discovered in 1947 when his granddaughter donated his papers to the State Historical Society. Most pages document routine findings from other investigations, measurements, interviews, sketches of equipment. But 6 pages, dated between February 16th and February 26th, 1875, are devoted entirely to Ashford. One entry stands out. The clerk, Penrose, escorted me through 3 filing cabinets. I requested all internal correspondence from January 1875 forward. He produced letters regarding coal shipments, equipment orders, payroll disputes. I asked specifically for correspondence related to the secondary shaft. He hesitated, checked the index twice, said there was none, but the index itself had been rewritten. Recent ink, different hand. Original entries visible beneath if held to light. Someone had updated the files within the last 10 days. Another entry, dated February 23rd, returned unannounced. Requested interview with Superintendent Holbrook. Told he was in Philadelphia on company business. Asked when he left. Clerk said February 16th, but I saw Holbrook on February 17th in the main office. I remember because he wore a gray coat with a torn button. And a final entry, dated February 26th, the day before Whitman submitted his report. Received letter this morning, unsigned. Delivered to my boarding house, not my office. One sentence. Your thoroughness is noted. Your family is in Harrisburg. I have a wife and 2 daughters. The journal contains no entries after that date. The timber arrived on February 9th, 2 days before the last equipment entry in Holbrook's ledger. The delivery came from a lumber yard in Altoona, 40 miles east. The invoice listed 64 support beams, cut to standard mine dimensions. 8 feet long, 10 inches square, treated with creosote to resist moisture. The shipment was routine. Mines consumed timber constantly, shoring up tunnels, replacing rotted beams, expanding into new veins. The invoice was signed by the supplier and countersigned by the Ashford receiving clerk, a man named Otto Falk. Falk had worked for the company for 6 years. He logged every delivery in a separate ledger kept in the surface warehouse. His handwriting was meticulous, each entry occupying exactly 2 lines: date, supplier, item description, quantity, destination within the mine. The February 9th entry reads, timber, 64 beams, Altoona Lumber Co., delivered main storage. Allocated primary shaft expansion per engineer request. Except the engineers submitted no such request. The primary shaft required no expansion in February 1875. The mine's operational plan, filed with the county the previous November, made no mention of new construction. The allocated timber should have sat in storage, waiting for a project that didn't exist. But it didn't sit in storage. On February 13th, Otto Falk made a second entry, squeezed beneath the original in smaller script: timber relocated, secondary shaft, superintendent authorization. No authorization form exists in the company files. And Otto Falk stopped coming to work on February 28th. The company listed him as voluntarily terminated. His final wages were mailed to a boarding house in Altoona. The landlord returned the envelope 3 weeks later, marked resident departed, no forwarding address. No one saw Otto Falk again. The geologist assigned to the Ashford mine was named Ernst Kellerman. He was German-born, trained in Freiburg, 41 years old. He had surveyed 17 mines across Pennsylvania and authored a technical manual on limestone stability. His job was to assess rock integrity, predict collapses, and determine where new veins might lie. He visited Ashford once per quarter, spending 3 days underground with a compass, a notebook, and a small hammer for testing stone density. His last visit concluded on January 28, 1875. His report, filed February 2nd, spans 4 pages. It describes the primary shaft as stable, the secondary shaft as exhausted, and the surrounding limestone as structurally sound with no indicators of imminent failure. He noted minor water seepage in the eastern tunnels but deemed it manageable with standard drainage. His final paragraph recommended expanding the primary shaft westward, where he suspected an untapped vein lay 20 feet deeper than current operations. He made no mention of the secondary shaft requiring any work. Yet on February 10th, Kellerman sent a telegram to the company office. The telegram was brief, as telegrams were, but it was logged in the Western Union records and later retrieved during a separate inquiry in 1889. It read, "Urgent. Secondary shaft integrity compromised. Recommend immediate inspection. Do not proceed with any operations until review complete. Kellerman." The company's response, sent the same day, acknowledged inspection scheduled Holbrook. No inspection was conducted, no follow-up correspondence exists, and on February 14th, 16 men were sent into the secondary shaft. Ernst Kellerman did not return to Ashford after the collapse. His contract was terminated on March 5th, cited as completion of project scope. He moved to Ohio, where he worked for a steel manufacturer until his death in 1891. Among his personal papers found by his daughter was a single sheet of paper, undated, unsigned, folded into quarters and kept in a Bible. It contained the partial draft of a letter addressed to the Pennsylvania Mine Safety Board. The letter accused the Ashford Company of gross negligence. It claimed the secondary shaft had been deliberately destabilized. It stated that Kellerman had evidence. The letter was never sent. The Ashford Company's store sold everything a miner's family needed: flour, salt pork, kerosene, cloth, medicine. Prices were higher than in town, but miners were paid in company scrip, currency only redeemable at company establishments. The store ledger recorded every transaction, every debt, every payment. It was an accounting of survival, measured in ounces and cents. The store manager, Leonard Voss, kept the ledger behind the counter in a locked drawer. He updated it twice daily, morning and evening, balancing credits and debits with the care of a man who understood that errors had consequences. The company audited the ledger monthly. Discrepancies meant termination. The ledger for February 1875 is housed in the county archive. Most entries are unremarkable: bread, molasses, lamp oil. But on February 12th, 2 days before the collapse, the ledger records an unusual transaction. Michael Brennan, the youngest of the 16 men, Margaret's husband, purchased 8 sticks of dynamite. Dynamite was not a typical purchase. The company supplied blasting materials directly to the mine. Workers did not buy explosives from the store. Dynamite was expensive, dangerous, and tightly regulated. Selling it to an individual miner violated company policy. Yet Leonard Voss logged the sale, noted the amount, and debited Brennan's account $6. No explanation accompanies the entry. No notation suggests why the sale was approved or what Brennan intended to use it for. 3 other miners purchased dynamite from the store in February: Patrick Callahan on February 10th, Owen Rafferty on February 11th, and Henry Moss on February 13th. All 3 men died in the collapse. Leonard Voss was questioned during the investigation. He confirmed the sales but stated he did not ask why the men needed dynamite. He assumed it was company authorized. When pressed, he admitted he found it strange but did not report it because the men paid in full and he saw no reason to interfere. After the collapse, the company's store stopped selling dynamite entirely. The remaining stock was moved to a locked magazine near the main shaft, accessible only to the blasting foreman. Leonard Voss continued managing the store until 1881, when he was found dead in his home. The coroner ruled it heart failure. He was 39 years old. The inquest into the Ashford collapse was held on March 3, 1875 in the county courthouse. It lasted 1 day. 7 witnesses testified: the mine foreman, the rescue crew leader, the company doctor, the shift supervisor, the watchman, the equipment clerk, and Superintendent Holbrook himself. The proceedings were recorded by a court stenographer, a woman named Eliza Trent, who transcribed every word in shorthand. The transcript runs 42 pages. Most of it is procedural, descriptions of the collapse, timelines, technical assessments. The testimony aligns with the investigator's report. Structural failure, undetectable weakness, unavoidable tragedy. The superintendent expressed regret. The foreman described the crew as experienced and cautious. The doctor confirmed the bodies could not be recovered safely. The inquest concluded that no criminal negligence occurred. The company was cleared of wrongdoing. The widow's compensation was finalized, but the stenographer's original shorthand notebook, preserved separately from the typed transcript, contains something the official record does not. On page 27, during Superintendent Holbrook's testimony, there is a break. The stenographer marked it with a single symbol, a small asterisk, in the margin. In shorthand, this indicates an off-the-record exchange, a moment when the judge instructs the stenographer to stop recording. These pauses are common during legal proceedings, usually for procedural clarifications or private conferences. This pause lasted 11 minutes. When the testimony resumed, Holbrook's tone had changed. The stenographer noted it in the margin. Voice lower. Hands steadier. The questions that followed were perfunctory. No one asked about the secondary shaft. No one mentioned the timber delivery. No one inquired about the dynamite purchases or the geologist's telegram. The inquest adjourned at 4:47 p.m. The widows received their payments within 2 weeks. The mine reopened in July, and Eliza Trent, the stenographer, resigned from her position 3 months later. She moved to Ohio, where she worked as a school teacher. She never transcribed another trial. Among her belongings, found after her death in 1903, was a single envelope. Inside was a page torn from her shorthand notebook, the page containing the 11-minute gap. The shorthand had been carefully, deliberately scratched out. The Episcopal Cemetery north of Ashford contains 16 graves in a single row. The headstones are modest, uniform, granite slabs with names, dates, and a shared inscription, in memory of those lost to the earth, February 14, 1875. The graves were purchased by the company and consecrated on February 22nd. The widows attended, the town attended. The priest spoke of eternity. But the graves are empty. No bodies were ever recovered from the collapse site. The company deemed excavation too dangerous, the structural instability too severe. The 16 men remain entombed beneath 200 feet of limestone and shattered timber, sealed where they fell. The headstones serve as markers for grief, not for burial. Yet one headstone, third from the left, bears a detail the others do not. Michael Brennan's stone includes a second date, carved smaller beneath the first, nearly hidden in the shadow of the engraved letters. Interment, delayed, March 9, 1875. Interment implies a body. Delayed implies a waiting period. But Michael Brennan's body was never retrieved. The company's own records confirm it. The rescue efforts ended on February 18th, 4 days after the collapse, with no recovery attempts planned. The widows were told the men would remain where they died, undisturbed, their graves marked symbolically above ground. So why does Michael Brennan's headstone reference an interment? The cemetery's burial register, kept by the church sexton, records all interments. On March 9, 1875, an entry reads, Michael Joseph Brennan, interred northeast corner, row 7, casket sealed. Service private, no family present. The northeast corner is not where Brennan's headstone stands. Row 7 is 200 feet away, near the back fence, beneath an oak tree. The graves there are older, dated to the 1850s and 1860s, marked with weathered stones and iron crosses. There should be no grave from 1875 in that section. But the earth there is disturbed, a rectangle of sunken ground, unmistakable even after decades. No headstone, no marker, just a depression in the soil where something was buried. And on the church's ledger, beside the March 9th entry, a notation in the sexton's hand, payment received in full, cash, no receipt issued. Jacob Lind, the mine foreman, kept a private journal separate from his official daily logs. This was common among mine supervisors, a place to record observations, concerns, decisions that didn't belong in company documents. Lind's journal was discovered in 1932 when his granddaughter sold his belongings to settle an estate. The journal contains entries spanning 3 years, from 1873 to 1876. The entries are terse, factual: weather conditions, equipment failures, minor disputes among the crew. Lind wrote the way he spoke, plainly, without embellishment. His handwriting was blunt, almost childlike. The letters formed with pressure that left grooves on the page beneath. The final entry is dated February 13, 1875, the day before the collapse. It reads, Holbrook came down himself today, didn't send a clerk, told me to pull the full crew for tomorrow. Secondary shaft. said there's a gas pocket needs tapping before we go deeper. I asked why all 16. He said because it's delicate. I asked if Kellerman approved it. He didn't answer. Just looked at me. I didn't ask again. We go at dawn. I don't like it. The shaft's been quiet for months, but it's not my call. I'll bring the lamps. I'll check every man before we descend. That's all I can do. Below that, in different ink, added later, I should have said no. Jacob Lind survived the collapse. He was on the surface when it happened, overseeing a coal shipment to the rail yard. He testified at the inquest. He confirmed the crew was experienced, the equipment sound, the protocols followed. He offered no speculation about cause. He expressed sorrow for the families. He resigned from the Ashford mine on March 15, 1875. He moved west to Illinois, where he worked as a farmhand until his death in 1889. He never worked in a mine again. His journal, the one containing the February 13th entry, was found in a trunk in his attic. It had been wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath folded blankets, as if hidden from sight, but kept too important to destroy. On the inside cover, written in faint pencil, almost illegible, "If you're reading this, you know it wasn't an accident." Natural gas pockets in coal mines were common, feared, and methodically managed. Miners called them fire damp, methane that seeped from coal seams, invisible and odorless until ignited. A single spark could trigger an explosion. A concentrated pocket could collapse a tunnel. Every miner knew the stories. Every mine had protocols. The Ashford mine had encountered fire damp twice in its 7-year operation, once in 1871, once in 1873. Both times, the pockets were detected with safety lamps, ventilated carefully, and tapped in controlled releases over several days. The process required a small crew, specialized equipment, and constant monitoring. Sending 16 men into a suspected gas pocket violated every principle of safe mining. Yet that was the explanation given. Superintendent Holbrook's testimony at the inquest stated that a gas pocket had been detected in the secondary shaft during a routine inspection. He claimed the decision to deploy the full crew was based on the need for rapid extraction before the gas accumulated further. He stated the men were briefed on the risk and proceeded with appropriate caution. He described the collapse as a tragic miscalculation, a pocket larger than anticipated, ignited by unknown means. But the mine's own records contradict this. The inspection logs for January and early February contain no notation of a gas pocket. The ventilation reports show normal readings. The foreman's official logs, separate from his private journal, make no mention of fire damp or any abnormal conditions in the secondary shaft. The safety lamps used by the crew were examined after the collapse. None showed evidence of gas exposure. The chemical residue left by burning methane, sulfurous, distinct, was not detected in the rubble. And the geologist Ernst Kellerman had declared the secondary shaft exhausted. Exhausted veins don't produce gas. The coal had been fully extracted months earlier. The shaft was dormant. There was no gas pocket, which means the 16 men were sent into the secondary shaft for a different reason. And someone knew exactly what would happen when they arrived. The rescue crew found the crate on February 16th, buried at the collapse's edge beneath 3 feet of limestone and splintered timber. It was intact. Pine boards, iron hinges, stamped with the company. The stamp read, "Property of Ashford Coal and Mineral Co. Do not open without authorization." The crate was empty. The rescue leader, a man named Simon Garrett, noted its presence in his report but did not elaborate. He assumed it was residual debris, a storage container misplaced during earlier operations. The company's inventory records showed hundreds of similar crates used for transporting equipment, tools, and supplies. Finding one in the mine was unremarkable, except this crate was supposed to be in the surface warehouse. The warehouse inventory, maintained by Otto Falk, logged every crate's location. Crate number 47, the one found in the rubble, was listed as stored in the main facility on January 20th, 1875. It was assigned to hold blasting materials, specifically dynamite and fuse wire. The inventory noted it was locked and required the superintendent's key to open. On February 10th, crate number 47 was checked out of the warehouse. The ledger entry reads, "Released to Holbrook. Authorized use secondary shaft. Return date unspecified." No one documented what was inside the crate when it was checked out. No one recorded what happened to its contents. And no one explained why an empty, authorized crate, one meant for controlled explosives, was found buried in the rubble of a collapse that killed 16 men. Simon Garrett retrieved the crate and delivered it to the company office. He gave it to Howard Penrose, the clerk. Penrose signed for it and placed it in the storage room behind the superintendent's office. When Charles Whitman, the investigator, requested to examine the crate 3 days later, he was told it had been destroyed in a warehouse fire. The fire occurred on February 23rd. It was small, contained, limited to a single storage alcove. The company reported the loss of miscellaneous equipment and outdated records. No injuries. Minimal damage. No other evidence of the fire exists. Simon Garrett, the rescue leader, was asked about the crate during a private interview in 1898, 23 years after the collapse. He was 71 years old by then, retired, living in a boarding house in Scranton. A local journalist, researching mine disasters, found him by chance and asked if he remembered Ashford. Garrett said he did. He described the rescue, the bodies they couldn't reach, the sound of the collapse still echoing in his sleep. Then he mentioned the crate. He said he'd never seen a crate that clean. Not a scratch, not a dent. Like it had been placed there, not buried. The journalist asked what he meant. Garrett said he didn't know. Only that it bothered him, still did. He died 3 months later. Heart failure, the doctor said. Margaret Brennan did not attend the inquest. She was not called to testify, and she did not request to speak. The company's compensation, $40, a sum calculated at 3 months' wages, was delivered to her door on March 11, 1875. She accepted it without comment. But on March 14th, she sent a letter to the Pennsylvania Mine Safety Board. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages, folded into an envelope with no return address. It was filed with the board's correspondence and forgotten until 1954, when a historian cataloging old records found it wedged between unrelated documents. The letter reads, "Sirs, my husband Michael Brennan was killed in the Ashford collapse. They say it was an accident. I do not believe them. 3 days before he died, Michael came home with something heavy in his coat. He would not tell me what it was. He said the superintendent asked him to do a job. He said it paid extra, but I wasn't to speak of it. He hid it in the shed. The morning he left, he kissed me differently, like he knew. After the collapse, I went back. I found what he hid. I am sending it to you because I do not know what else to do. If this was an accident, why did they need this?" The letter was unsigned. No enclosure accompanied it. The board filed it as a grievance, logged it in their records, and took no further action. The investigators' report had already concluded the collapse was structural failure. The case was closed. But the letter's existence raises a question. What did Margaret Brennan find in the shed? The shed behind the Brennan home burned down on March 20th, 1875. The fire occurred at night. No one saw it start. The local fire brigade arrived too late to save anything. The shed's contents, tools, firewood, whatever Michael Brennan had hidden, were reduced to ash. The company investigated the fire and concluded it was caused by a knocked-over lantern. Margaret Brennan was not home when the fire started. She was at her sister's house 3 miles away. She returned to find the shed gone, the ground scorched black, and a crowd of neighbors standing in her yard. She did not speak to anyone. She went inside, locked the door, and did not emerge for 2 days. She left Ashford on April 2nd. No one knew where she went. The boarding house where she lived was rented to a new family. Her few belongings, clothes, dishes, a wedding photograph were left behind. The landlord sold them to cover unpaid rent. She was never seen in Ashford again. But in 1891, a woman matching Margaret Brennan's description appeared at a union meeting in Scranton. She did not give her name. She stood at the back of the hall and listened as miners' advocates discussed safety reforms, company abuses, and the need for accountability. When the meeting ended, she approached the speaker, a labor organizer named Daniel Weaver. She handed him an envelope and walked out before he could ask her name. Inside the envelope was a fuse wire, 12 inches long, standard mining grade. One end was frayed, as if cut hastily. The other end was scorched black. Attached to the fuse was a note, written in the same handwriting as the 1875 letter to the Mine Safety Board. They didn't die by accident. They died because they knew too much, and so will anyone who tries to prove it. Marcus Holbrook kept a private ledger separate from the company's official accounting books. This ledger was not part of the standard filing system. It was not audited monthly or reviewed by the board. It was personal, bound in black leather, kept in the locked bottom drawer of his desk in the superintendent's office. The ledger was discovered in 1903, 28 years after the collapse, when the Ashford mine was finally shuttered and the office building sold to a salvage company. Workers dismantling the superintendent's desk found the drawer's false bottom. Beneath it, wrapped in waxed canvas, was the ledger. It was turned over to the new property owners, who passed it to the County Historical Society, where it was catalogued as Ashford Mine Administrative Records, 1872 to 1876. Most of the ledger contains routine financial notations, coal shipments, equipment purchases, payroll adjustments, but interspersed among these entries are notations that don't align with official company records. They are listed under a separate heading, Special Accounts. The entries are cryptic, abbreviated, recorded in a shorthand only Holbrook would have understood. But certain patterns emerge. February 4, 1875, SR Advance $200 Consulting. February 8, 1875, Materials Rec Secondary Prep $85. February 10th, more 875, Crew Incentive, Additional 4 men, 120s. February 12th, 1875, Final Delivery, LP Confirmed, Settlement Pending. The initials don't correspond to anyone on the company payroll. The amounts aren't reflected in the company's official budget. The descriptions suggest preparations, payments, arrangements made off the books. And then, on February 15th, the day after the collapse, a single entry. Account closed, all records transferred, Philadelphia settlement complete. Below that, a line drawn through the entire special accounts section. Every prior entry crossed out with a single stroke of the pen, as if sealing it from further reference. The ledger contains no entries after February 15th. Marcus Holbrook resigned from the Ashford Coal and Mineral Company on March 30th, 1875. The company thanked him for his 9 years of service and issued a statement praising his leadership during a period of unforeseeable tragedy. He was given a severance package and a letter of recommendation. He moved to Philadelphia, where he took a position as a financial consultant for a consortium of mining interests. He lived comfortably. He married. He had 3 children. He died in 1902, aged 61, of pneumonia. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer described him as a respected businessman and community benefactor. His estate was settled quietly. No unusual assets were noted. No suspicious holdings were uncovered. But in the ledger found in his desk, on the final page, the page after the crossed-out entries, someone had written a single sentence in pencil, faint but legible. 16 men. 28 pounds. 1 mistake. 28 pounds was the weight of commercial-grade dynamite required to collapse a reinforced mine shaft. The Ashford Coal and Mineral Company was owned by a holding corporation based in Philadelphia, the Keystone Industrial Consortium. Keystone controlled 17 mines across Pennsylvania, along with rail interests, limestone quarries, and iron foundries. It was managed by a board of 7 directors, men who rarely visited the mines they owned, but who met quarterly to review profits and approve expansion plans. The board meeting scheduled for March 1875 was postponed. No explanation was given in the official minutes. The next recorded meeting occurred in May, 6 weeks after the Ashford collapse. The minutes from that meeting, archived in the Pennsylvania State Library, are brief. They note the closure of the investigative proceedings, the resumption of operations at Ashford, and a motion to increase safety training across all Keystone properties. They do not mention the 16 dead men by name. But beneath the official minutes, in a separate folder marked Executive Session Confidential, there is a single sheet of paper. It is a financial summary dated March 18, 1875, and signed by the board's chairman, William Crenshaw. The summary lists a payment of $12,000 dispersed from the Keystone Emergency Fund to an entity labeled Settlement Services, Philadelphia. No further description is given, no recipient is named. The payment is categorized as incident management. $12,000 in 1875 is equivalent to roughly $300,000 today. It was an extraordinary sum, far exceeding the combined compensation paid to the 16 widows. It was enough to purchase silence, destroy evidence, or ensure cooperation. And it was approved 3 days before the inquest concluded. The board member who authorized the payment, William Crenshaw, was a Philadelphia attorney with deep ties to Pennsylvania's industrial elite. He served on the boards of 6 corporations, advised 2 governors, and owned a mansion on Rittenhouse Square. He was known for his discretion, his influence, and his ability to resolve problems quietly. He retired in 1882 and died in 1888. His personal papers were donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Among them, buried in a box of routine correspondence, is a telegram dated February 16, 1875, 2 days after the collapse. It reads, "Ashford situation containable. Investigator cooperative. Recommend full closure. Advise no further inquiries. Crenshaw." The telegram was sent to Marcus Holbrook. 3 witnesses gave testimony at the March 3rd inquest: the mine foreman, the rescue crew leader, and the company doctor. Their statements were recorded, transcribed, and filed. They aligned perfectly with the investigators' conclusion: structural failure, unavoidable. But in 1889, 14 years after the collapse, a labor dispute at another Keystone-owned mine led to a Senate subcommittee investigation into mine safety practices across Pennsylvania. During the hearings, testimony was taken from dozens of miners, foremen, and company officials. The goal was to assess whether mining companies were adhering to safety regulations or prioritizing profit over human life. Among those called to testify was Simon Garrett, the rescue leader from Ashford. Garrett was 62 by then, no longer working underground. He lived modestly, survived on a small pension, and rarely spoke about his mining years. When questioned about his experience, he provided straightforward answers. He described his career, his roles, the dangers he'd witnessed. Then, one of the senators asked if he'd ever encountered a mine disaster that seemed unusual. Garrett hesitated. The transcript notes it. Witness paused, asked for water. Then he mentioned Ashford. He said the collapse didn't look like the others he'd seen. He said the rubble was too uniform, the fracture too clean. He said the air smelled wrong, not sulfur from gas, but something chemical, sharp. He said he'd reported it to the investigator, but his concerns weren't included in the final report. The senator asked why. Garrett said he didn't know. Only that he'd been visited a week later by a company representative who thanked him for his testimony and offered him a year's wages as a bonus. He took the money. He had a family. But he never stopped wondering. The committee asked if he had proof. Garrett said no. Just a memory. Just a smell he couldn't place. The committee moved on to other questions. Garrett's testimony was recorded but not pursued further. The investigation concluded with recommendations for improved ventilation and stricter oversight. No specific companies were sanctioned. But 2 years later, in 1891, a lawyer named Thomas Everett began compiling evidence for a potential civil suit against Keystone Industrial. Everett represented the families of miners killed in a separate disaster at a Keystone mine in 1887. While researching, he came across Garrett's 1889 testimony. He wrote to Garrett asking if he'd be willing to testify again, this time under oath, in detail. Garrett wrote back. His letter, preserved in Everett's case files, was brief. "I told the truth once. I was lucky to walk away. I have grandchildren now. I'm sorry." Garrett died in 1899. Natural causes, the certificate said. Simon Garrett was not the only witness whose story changed or whose silence was purchased. By 1880, the labor movement in Pennsylvania's coal country was gaining strength. Miners were organizing, demanding safer conditions, fair wages, and accountability for deaths caused by negligence. The Workingmen's Benevolent Association, a union formed in the 1860s, had grown into a powerful force. It challenged companies in court, led strikes, and documented abuses that official investigations ignored. The union kept its own records, independent of company files and government archives. These records included incident reports filed by miners or their families, testimonies gathered outside official inquiries, and evidence that might otherwise be suppressed. The records were stored in union halls, passed down through leadership changes, and occasionally consulted by labor historians. In 1883, a union organizer named Patrick McGowan began compiling a list of mining disasters that he believed warranted reinvestigation. He called it the unresolved file. It included 12 incidents across 5 states, collapses, explosions, floods, where the official conclusions seemed incomplete or suspicious. Ashford was among them. McGowan's notes on Ashford, written in pencil on lined paper, survive in the archives of the United Mine Workers of America. They read, Ashford, PA, 1875, 16 dead, secondary shaft. Company claims gas pocket, no gas detected post-collapse. Foreman's journal contradicts official timeline. Widow filed complaint, never pursued. Investigators draft report missing 3 pages. Union contact in area reports multiple witnesses paid to stay quiet. Recommend full review if political climate permits. The political climate never permitted it. The union faced its own battles, strikes, legal challenges, violent opposition from company enforcers. Ashford became one case among many, a tragic data point in a larger struggle. McGowan's notes were filed away, and the union moved on to fights it could win. But McGowan didn't forget. In 1901, 2 years before his death, he gave an interview to a labor newspaper, the Anthracite Advocate. The journalist asked if there were cases that still haunted him. McGowan mentioned several, then paused. Ashford, he said, that one never sat right. Too clean, too fast, too many people who stopped talking. The journalist asked if he thought it was deliberate. McGowan answered carefully. I think 16 men went into a shaft they shouldn't have gone into. I think someone sent them there. And I think everyone who might have said otherwise either got paid or got scared. The interview was published on page 7 of a 4-page newspaper. Few people read it. Fewer remembered it. But the unresolved file remained in the Union archives, waiting for someone to open it again. In 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, a young labor historian named Catherine Wells discovered McGowan's notes while researching mine safety for her dissertation. She spent 2 years tracking down surviving records from Ashford, ledgers, testimonies, family letters. She interviewed descendants of the victims. She corresponded with archivists across Pennsylvania. Her dissertation, The Suppressed Tragedies, Industrial Negligence and Institutional Silence in Pennsylvania Coal Mining, 1870 to 1900, was completed in 1934. It devoted an entire chapter to Ashford, concluding that the collapse was likely caused by deliberate sabotage disguised as an accident. Her dissertation was rejected by 3 universities. The 4th accepted it, but required her to remove the Ashford chapter. She refused. She never completed her PhD. Catherine Wells died in 1978. Her dissertation, unpublished, was donated to a regional labor archive. It sat on a shelf for 30 years. In 2008, a graduate student found it, read it, and reopened the Ashford case. In 1875, structural engineering was still an emerging science. Bridges collapsed, buildings cracked, mines failed. But engineers were beginning to understand forces, compression, tension, shear. They developed calculations, safety margins, methods for predicting failure. When the Ashford collapse occurred, the company hired an independent engineering firm to assess the site and determine the cause. The firm was based in Pittsburgh, well regarded, with experience in mine construction. The lead engineer, a man named Frederick Lawson, visited Ashford in late February and spent 4 days examining the rubble, measuring fracture angles, and testing the surrounding stone. His report, submitted March 8, 1875, was marked confidential for company review only. It was not made public. It was not filed with the county. It was not referenced in the inquest. The company received it, reviewed it, and archived it in their internal files. The report was rediscovered in 1957 during the liquidation of Keystone Industrial's remaining assets. It was found in a locked file cabinet, bundled with other obsolete documents, and transferred to the State Historical Archive as part of a mandatory record retention requirement. The report is 11 pages. It includes diagrams, measurements, and detailed observations. Lawson's conclusion, written in precise technical language, reads, "The observed fracture pattern is inconsistent with natural structural failure. The collapse originated at a single point within the secondary shaft, with radiating fractures indicating a sudden, concentrated force. The intact timber supports adjacent to the collapse site show no signs of gradual stress or degradation. The limestone ceiling displays percussion marks consistent with explosive disruption, not geological weakness. He continues, natural collapses in limestone formations of this type progress incrementally, with visible cracking, minor rock falls, and audible warnings over hours or days. The Ashford collapse occurred instantaneously, with no prior indicators. This is consistent with controlled demolition, not geological failure. His final paragraph, it is the opinion of this firm that the collapse was induced by external force, likely explosive in nature. Whether this force was accidental or deliberate cannot be determined without further investigation into the materials present at the site prior to the incident. However, structural failure due to natural causes is, in my professional assessment, implausible. The report was never published. No follow-up investigation was conducted. Frederick Lawson's firm continued operating for another 20 years. Lawson himself never spoke publicly about Ashford. In 1895, he was asked during a private conversation, recorded in a colleague's diary, whether he'd ever encountered a case where his findings were ignored. He said yes. Just once. He didn't name the case, but he said it was the reason he stopped consulting for mining companies. The Ashford mine reopened on July 2, 1875, 4.5 months after the collapse. The secondary shaft remained sealed, deemed too unstable for excavation. The bodies of the 16 men were left entombed. The company shifted operations to the primary shaft and the western expansion Kellerman had recommended. For 8 months, the mine operated without incident. Production resumed. New miners were hired to replace the dead. The town of Ashford returned to its rhythm. Shifts, pay, the slow grinding of coal from stone. Then, on March 19, 1876, the mine collapsed again. This time, the collapse occurred in the primary shaft, 200 feet from the original site. 9 men were working the tunnel face when the ceiling gave way. 6 died instantly. 3 were pulled from the rubble alive, but succumbed to their injuries within hours. The rescue effort lasted 2 days. The bodies were recovered and buried in the same cemetery as the first 16. The second collapse triggered a new investigation. This one was led by state officials, not the county. Public pressure had mounted. Families demanded answers. The union threatened strikes if the mine reopened without a full safety review. The investigator, a man named Henry Parnell, was more thorough than his predecessor. He examined the collapse site, interviewed survivors, reviewed company records. His report, filed April 30th, 1876, concluded that the collapse was caused by inadequate support structures in newly excavated tunnels. He recommended the mine be shut down until comprehensive reinforcements were installed. But buried in Parnell's supplementary notes, pages not included in the official report, is an observation. The primary shaft collapse occurred directly above the sealed secondary shaft. The 2 sites are connected by a vertical fissure, approximately 18 inches wide, that extends through the limestone bedrock. This fissure was not present during the initial investigation in February 1875. It appears to have formed after the first collapse, suggesting the secondary shaft failure destabilized a larger section of the mine than previously assessed. He continues, I inquired whether the secondary shaft had been inspected for ongoing structural degradation since its sealing. The company stated that no such inspection was conducted as the shaft was deemed permanently closed. This raises the question. If the first collapse was as severe as reported, why was the structural integrity of the surrounding mine not reassessed before resuming operations? Parnell's report recommended shutting down the mine permanently. The company ignored the recommendation. They installed additional supports, hired a new foreman, and reopened the mine in August 1876. It operated for another 2 years without major incident. Then, in 1878, the Ashford Coal and Mineral Company declared bankruptcy. The mine was sold to a regional competitor, who operated it intermittently until 1882. After that, it was abandoned. The sealed secondary shaft and the 16 men still buried within it were left undisturbed. In 1903, the mine entrance was filled with concrete and marked with a small plaque. Ashford Mine. Established 1868, closed 1882, in memory of those lost. No names, no dates, just memory. The plaque was removed in 1954 during highway construction. Its current location is unknown. In 1998, a woman named Claire Dolan, great-great-granddaughter of Liam Dolan, one of the 16 men, began researching her family history. She started with birth certificates, marriage records, census data. She traced her lineage back to Ireland, to the immigration ships, to the Pennsylvania coal towns where her ancestors worked and died. When she reached the Ashford collapse, she found the usual records: death certificate, burial marker, newspaper obituary. But she also found something unexpected: a box of letters in her grandmother's attic. Letters written by Liam Dolan's widow, Nora, to her sister in Boston. Letters spanning 1875 to 1889. Letters that had never been read outside the family. The letters are mundane in many ways: descriptions of daily life, struggles with money, the loneliness of widowhood, but interspersed among them are references to the collapse. Nora never explicitly states that the collapse was anything other than an accident, but she writes around it, circles it, implies something darker. One letter, dated June 1875, reads, "They paid me $80. They said it was generous. They said I should be grateful, but it's not about the money. It's that they paid me before I even asked, like they knew I'd keep quiet if they gave me enough." Another, from November 1876. "I ran into Jacob Lind at the market today. He didn't look at me. He used to tip his hat whenever he saw me. But today he turned away. I think he's ashamed. I think he knows." And a final letter from March 1889. "I'm getting older. My health is failing. But I still dream about Liam. He's standing at the mine entrance and he's trying to tell me something. But I can't hear him. The ground is too loud. I wake up and I wonder if he knew. If they all knew. If someone told them it was a job and they went because they needed the money. Because that's what miners do. They go where they're told and they trust the company to keep them safe. And sometimes the company lies." Claire Dolan published excerpts from the letters in a regional history journal in 2003. She included a researcher's note. "These letters suggest that the widows of Ashford suspected something more than structural failure. They did not have proof, but they lived with doubt. They accepted compensation not because they believed the official story, but because they had no other choice. In the absence of evidence, grief becomes acceptance, but acceptance is not the same as truth." In 2005, Claire Dolan filed a formal request with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission to reopen the investigation into the Ashford collapse. She submitted the letters, the engineering report, the foreman's journal, and McGowan's union notes as supporting evidence. The commission reviewed her request. In a letter dated August 2006, they responded, "We appreciate your diligence in preserving your family's history. However, the Ashford collapse occurred 131 years ago. All involved parties are deceased. The mine is sealed. The records, while suggestive, do not constitute definitive proof of criminal wrongdoing. As such, we cannot justify the allocation of public resources to reinvestigate a case that has been officially closed for over a century. We encourage you to continue your research and wish you the best in your endeavors." Claire Dolan died in 2019. Before she died, she donated all of the letters, documents, and research materials she had collected to the Ashford County Historical Society. They remain there in a file labeled Dolan Collection, Ashford Mine Disaster, 1875. Anyone can access them. Few do. The Ashford mine site is overgrown now. The entrance was filled with concrete in 1903, but nature has reclaimed the rest. Trees grow where the equipment yard once stood. Vines cover the remnants of the ore carts. The ground is uneven, scarred by decades of settling and erosion, as if the earth itself remembers what happened below. There is no marker, no memorial, no plaque bearing the names of the 16 men who died on February 14, 1875. The cemetery where their empty graves were dug is still there, but the headstones have weathered. Some are cracked, some have toppled. The inscriptions are faint, barely legible. Visitors rarely come. The town of Ashford still exists, though it's smaller now, fewer than 300 people, most of them unaware of the mine's history. The Ashford Coal and Mineral Company is long gone, absorbed into larger corporations, dissolved, forgotten. The Keystone Industrial Consortium no longer exists. The men who authorized the payments, signed the reports, and ensured the silence, they are all dead. And yet the questions remain. Why were 16 men sent into a sealed shaft on a fabricated pretense? Why did 4 of them purchase dynamite days before the collapse? What was inside the crate found in the rubble? Who paid $12,000 to ensure the investigation concluded quickly? What happened to the 3 missing pages of Charles Whitman's preliminary report? The answers are buried with the men. Or perhaps they were destroyed decades ago, burned, shredded, locked away in archives that will never be opened. Perhaps the truth was known by a small number of people who carried it to their graves, unwilling to speak even in their final days. Or perhaps the truth is simpler, darker, that 16 men were expendable. That profits mattered more than lives, that institutions protect themselves first and always, and that the official story is simply the story that survived. History is written by those who control the records, and the records say it was an accident. But records lie. Institutions lie. People lie when they're paid to, when they're threatened, when silence feels safer than truth. What doesn't lie is the pattern, the coincidences that stack too neatly, the witnesses who disappeared or changed their testimonies, the evidence that vanished, the questions that were never asked. The Ashford collapse was not an accident. It was a decision. Someone made it, someone paid for it, someone ensured it would be forgotten. And for 150 years it has been. In the fall of 2017, a geology student from a nearby university was conducting a thesis project on limestone erosion in abandoned mine sites. She obtained permission to survey the Ashford site using ground-penetrating radar. The goal was to map the subsurface tunnels and assess long-term structural changes. The radar revealed what was expected: collapsed tunnels, voids, areas of instability. But it also revealed something else: a large enclosed chamber deep within the secondary shaft. The chamber was intact, sealed off by the collapse but structurally sound. It measured roughly 30 feet wide, 15 feet high. Inside the chamber, the radar detected 16 distinct mass anomalies. The bodies, still there, still entombed. But the radar also detected something else: a concentrated mass separate from the bodies, positioned near the chamber's center, dense, compact, metallic. The student reported her findings to her advisor. The advisor contacted the State Geological Survey. The survey reviewed the data and confirmed the anomaly. They noted it in their records and recommended no further action. The mine was sealed. The site was unstable. Excavation would be dangerous and prohibitively expensive. The student completed her thesis. She moved on to other projects. The radar data was archived. But before she submitted her final report, she wrote a personal note, kept in her research journal, never published. "I don't know what's down there, but I know it doesn't belong. Whatever they were supposed to be doing in that shaft, it wasn't mining coal. And whatever that object is, it's still there, waiting." The Ashford mine has not been opened since 1903. The 16 men remain where they fell, undisturbed, beneath 200 feet of stone and silence. The records say it was an accident. The earth knows otherwise, and someday, perhaps in another 100 years, perhaps sooner, someone will break the seal. Someone will descend into the darkness. Someone will find the chamber, the bodies, the object that doesn't belong. And when they do, the mine will finally tell its truth. Until then, it waits, as it has always waited, as it always will.